I just want to make a short note that from the 2nd of June, Hartmut is actually going to be full professor.
Thank you.
So welcome to this talk. It's titled, When the Hive Mind Goes to Town with Multi-Method Analysis. And the reason for doing this is that when we try to understand games, there are so many lenses we can use to understand them. And since we are individuals, we kind of know what we know, but this is a way to inform each other about how to look at the same artifact in different ways. And now we have already been so nicely introduced, so I'm going to quickly flick through these. So thank you. You already covered basically everything we had prepared for that. Unless you want to say a few words.
Well, these are, Mirjam's paintings, and also look at mirjamarts.net. And her Saatchi, she sells these things on Saatchi, and they're fantastic. About me, I mean, you already said everything that is important, and I've been doing stuff in education also since the 90s, and this is some of my artistic stuff. I'm also the president of ARDIN, the Association for Research in Digital Interactive Narrative. So if you're into any form of interactive narrative, look at ardin.online. We do the yearly interactive digital narrative storytelling conference, and the next deadline is on the 25th of June, and it will be in Kobe, Japan this year. So look up for iKids 2023. And I'm also leading a cost action network on interactive narrative for complexity representations. Right, back to you.
Right, so a couple of years ago we were discussing this problem also, that there's a tendency that when you have a toolbox, you have a hammer in it, this old metaphor, that everything looks like a nail if you have a hammer. But given that there is such a broad toolbox of methods for analysis, we were thinking how can we make this process quicker? So we wrote the paper that we had, we presented it in 2020 because, pandemic. But the background for it is really this, how can we use multi-method jams? How can we sit together, a big group of people in small groups? This is the reason, and that is where the idea comes from. And the whole idea is to use maybe 3 or 4 hours on each artifact, around 20, 30 people, come to find what is actually the key aspect, which is super important and interesting to study with this particular game, and try different methods for doing it.
Right. But, let's start a bit over here. What is a game, right? And, the answer is sort of it depends, right? And you might also be, as game scholars, as game developers, as, games students, that there's this question of how do we define a game, right? And you might be aware there's, actually you can look it up, gamedefinitions.com, I think, where there's a project where you can have randomized game definitions, which show that there's a problem understanding what a game actually is. But it really depends on the chosen lens, right? And if we look at a game, let's say for example Firewatch, and that was what we used for our first MMA jam. If we ask, for example, Anna-Kaisa Kultima, who, she would probably say, we can understand interactive works through the practice of making them, right? And that means looking at the development process, looking at the artwork created, you're looking at, how did people use, let's say, Unreal or Unity. And that is part of her game design praxeology research, and that's here the title page of her PhD thesis, but it's really looking at all the practices of making, ethnographic approach, looking at what happened during the development, right? And if we ask, at the same time, if we ask Mirjam, she would probably say, okay, we can understand games through retellings, right? And that's looking at what people say about the game after they played it, right? In the end, I didn't care all that much about mystery being solved, however, I did care about Henry's overall progression, and that's again about Firewatch in this case. And that, of course, comes from Mirjam's paper from 2018 about retellings, and where she says the occurrence of retellings can be considered as an indicator for a well-designed interactive degenerative system and as an instrument of critique, right? And this paper, by the way, won the Best Paper Award at ICIDS 2018. Yet another perspective is, let's say, if you ask Petri Lankowski, right? And he would probably say something like, we can understand the game through the formal qualities, right? And that means we look at, basically, we do, in the end, some sort of a content analysis, identify these different formal qualities. And he wrote about that together with Staffan Björk and says formal analysis is the name for research where an artifact and specific elements are examined closely. The relations of the elements are described in detail, right? And this formal analysis can be done on individual artifacts in isolation. And when, for example, if we look at somebody like Christian Roth, who is a specialist in evaluation, he would probably say he can understand games through the effects they have on their audience, right? I mean, what does they do to us? For example, this, sort of nice warm quality of much of Firewatch and the sort of, in a sense, not so nice backstory. And I mean, he will probably say, let's look at these different, dimensions that we can measure, and his measurement toolbox has these sort of different, dimensions: usability, effectiveness, autonomy, flow, presence, role identification, curiosity, suspense, believability, eudaimonic appreciation, affect, and enjoyment. And that is also a way how we can understand the game. And, when we asked René Klaas and Jesper van der Vught, they will probably say we need to play a game to understand it, right? And that would mean looking at something like, a let's play here. Oh, and we don't seem to have internet, but, so, I mean, they actually propose a method, and we also use it in their own education, to instead have written essays, have let's play videos, right? To get an understanding of what the game is. And so making the play itself and the reflection of the play while we're playing it, basically the method. And finally, if you would ask me, I would say, well, if it's a narrative game, we can understand it for a specific method or a framework like my SPP model. And that would be that I say, okay, I mean, we have a proto-story and an instantiation, and I have an objective, a product, or a subjective product, and then we can look into the different elements of the proto-story and identify them. And of course, that's in my book that just came out. Right, so with all of that, who is right? Right? Me, of course, no. Me? That's exactly the problem, right? And that's why I'm saying that. No, of course, Mirjam is right. Yeah. So, of course, nobody and everyone, right? So, different lenses let us see different aspects, right? Yet, if we think that also about it, every lens we use excludes something else, right? If we use the one lens, we don't use the other lens. We identify things that we don't see if we would have used another lens, and it's a bit like that, right? We take on blinders with every analytical lens that we're using. And I mean, that means basically different lenses let us see different aspects, but also exclude different aspects at the very same time. Right? And that was sort of the starting discussion that Mirjam and I had a couple of years ago, and where we sort of said, how can we understand games and interactive digital narratives better? And Mirjam's solution was then, can we not do a multi-method analysis, right? And then, of course, that's a great idea by itself, right? And with that, I'm handing over to Mirjam again, introducing multi-method analysis.
Yeah, so the idea then was to have additional understanding through making this combination of many. For example, how can the development process, information about that, what can that help us understand about why things are retold so much or not told at all? How can formal aspects help us understand interactive narratives in games by focusing on the type of grammar that is present in the game design mechanics and what object and doing content analysis and things like that. Another thing is how can it lead to transformation, looking at transformational aspects of a game. So this slide here is a ton of different images from the game Firewatch, which was the first MMA jam we ran about this. The problem is, it takes time to analyze a game. It takes many hours to play through it. It takes many hours to interview people about their experiences. It takes time to find the developers and ask them what they did. So who has that much time? I mean, no one really. And that is the problem for game researchers when we really try to get into the depth of what is important to study and how we do it. So then we were thinking, how about we just come together? And this was our first attempt. This was our preparation and invitation. So at the DIGRA 2022, we prepared 4 groups, and it's important to know that these methods were chosen only because we had experts in the organizational team that had those lenses and knew those lenses. There are many other lenses, so in another group formation there would be other and more lenses, and some of them wouldn't be there. So we already talked about them. So we had 4 groups in this one. This is supposed to be Petri with his formal analysis. That's Hartmut with the interactive narrative design. This is Renee and Jesper doing close playing, and me, and I banded together with Christian Roth to do both the meaning-making analysis and looking at retellings.
And I think we actually had a 5th group. We had also Anna Kaiser online.
Oh, yes, we did,
right?
Doing the praxeology. Yeah, exactly. And we didn't have her the second time, unfortunately. Yeah. So I think this is where I hand over to you again, right?
Okay, good. So basically, so far we have done 2 MMA jams, one at DIGRA 2022 and one at ICIDS 2022. And the very first one we did in Krakow last summer was on Firewatch, basically. And the second one we did on unpacking, and that means you already see our method. We choose one game and then we put all the groups on this particular game. And I think one thing then we can say is that MMA jams work as a method. Should we promise that eventually there will be a paper on that? But I mean, one of the problems is you get a ton of data, right? I mean, we should probably admit that right now. But it is absolutely true that many insights are created in a condensed time frame. We're talking 4 hours, right? And that actually works, and it's astonishing when you have so many people with different methods really work on something as concentrated that you get a lot of results. And you know, another insight that we can already talk about, it really is true that different methods of analysis inform each other. Okay, with that I hand back to you.
Yeah, so this is an example from one of the work groups. So this was me and Christian and David Chue. So this is kind of the structure for each of them, for each of the groups, and then I'm going to fill in. So first, group members coming together. So where do I come from? What's my expertise? What do I want out from this? Then making sure that we're all on the same page about what this method actually means. Then doing okay, so what kind of data do we study? do that selection, then do the analysis, and then do the wrap-up. So in the case of Firewatch here, it was Christian, David, and me, and we kind of told each other how we had experienced the game when we played it, like in preparation for the workshop, and what we wanted out of the day. Then we just made sure that we all knew what is retellings, and I only have that slide, I don't have Christian's one here. Just having like a quick reference of retellings and what it is, and what types we can look at to study and find. Then we decided, so how are we going to do this? So we decided to first play the game, do a stream together, play it cooperatively for half an hour. Then we did then to do some web scraping, look at the data we scraped, and then, but first we also needed to define, okay, where do we actually scrape the data? And in this case, we identified that there was lots of information on Reddit, and there was lots of information kind of on the web. So we used this tool at WebScraper.io, gathered the data, and let's see. And these are just like a couple of the things that we looked at. We looked at both like text representations, memories, how people had made paintings out of the games, how they had written song lyrics about the game, how they have generated AI images based on their games, trying to kind of reflect their own experience. And doing that then, we looked at, okay, so what stood out, like based on our own play experience and the data we scraped. And what we could see very quickly was that lots of discussions was about the agency in the game. There was a kind of discrepancy between local and global agency. So there was little global agency and a lot of local. We could also see common themes in what people retold. It was a lot about grief. The backstory of the game is this guy kind of leaves everything, his life, and kind of reinvents himself like out in the woods, while he's having an interesting conversation with someone over the phone. And that's also something, the second theme that was very prominent, that they looked at the relationship progression for that. And then we kind of quickly find out, okay, so how do we explain our findings to the rest of the group? Made a couple of slides, bang.
Right, so, and I, with my group, used the SPP model for analysis, which again is basically understanding an interactive digital narrative, a narrative game as comprised of a system, a proto-story being instantiated through the interactive process into either objective products or subjective products, and also having an understanding of what I call the triple hermeneutic that comes in replay, where we interpret the possibilities of interaction, what we interpret, what has been understood so far, the narrative so far, and we also reflect on prior traversals, basically. And I mean, I have to say, I mean, in the first one, my group was somewhat less successful because the people that signed up for that workshop hadn't played Firewatch. So that was a big problem. So we spent like, 1.5, 2 hours on actually playing it before we could start on the analysis. That is basically a process where you go through and identify material first. When you basically categorize this material into assets, UI, and procedure components, and when you start looking into how these things are assembled in the narrative design, basically in a particular proto-story, and when, if available, of course, also using web scraping and other things, other additional developer information you can add to that. And, then basically, finally you look how, from the system process product perspective, how this proto-story comes together in the process and what kind of product is created. So, I mean, our first results in Firewatch was basically identifying these different elements of the proto-story, starting to understand the particular narrative design, how that basically looks like, how, I mean, for example, Firewatch starts with a 3D space, it then goes to hypertext, which represents basically a shift in time. It goes back in time, basically. When it goes back into a 3D space, depending on your respective choices, and it continues like that until it finally leaves the hypertext space completely behind, which means these sort of structures get instantiated into this kind of structure. And that's what we got out of that. Yes, so that was basically the result that my group got, and you see that the results in Mirjam's group were much better, because this group was much better prepared in terms of knowing the game first, which is one of the big insights basically. Good, so for iGates 2022, we chose a different game, Unpacking, and I'm handing back to you.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about how we kind of merge the data afterwards, but first we'll just go through what we did, like in our respective groups for the Unpacking game. So it will come. So we did the same thing again. We were 3 people on site in Santa Cruz. We introduced each other, we had played the game, but we also wanted to kind of look at that. So we went through the same procedure, looking at, so what is retellings, making sure that we were on the same page about that. But then we also made an extra playthrough together, a short one for, again, maybe half an hour. And like also told each other, like we did retellings to each other in both groups. Like when I played, this bit really caught my memory. This is where it resonated with me, and this happened. So we kind of exchanged those stories. Then we looked at, okay, how can we find other retellings besides our own? And we identified YouTube, the Steam community, Twitch, and then we also found kind of interesting stuff like just by broad web searches. So we divided, we kind of took one data source each and started to find materials, gathered that, and we showed each other what we found. For example, blogs where people wrote about their gameplay experience, what happened to them. Other types of retellings, lots of blogs with the spoiler alerts. We also found lots of swag, like player-created swag for unpacking stuff that actually would exist if you wanted to have the same thing in your home. And we were also kind of watching different types of videos. We found Twitch video streams. We watched a couple of those, or like we took like small bits of it. We looked at the YouTube materials, and that kind of seeing also what was pivotal moments for people playing it. And also longer texts, longer analytical texts. And at the streaming community, we also found quite a lot. And there were, at the time we were playing, there were currently 7 Twitch streams going on simultaneously, which we watched a little bit from. And there something in particular that stood out. I'm not sure if this one, yeah. So so the game itself, I don't know, how many have played it here? So what it is that you're kind of moving, the sequence of this game is that a woman moves, so you kind of help her unpack her boxes every time. And at one point in her life, now this is a spoiler, I'm afraid, she has moved in together with a guy, and she's trying to find somewhere to put her diploma, but there's no place for that in that home. And later on, she moves away, and there's other things happening. And many people had looked at that particular thing. So what we did here then, after we had kind of assembled all this data, now again, 2 hours has passed, we're already here. So we talked about the certificate. We found that, shit, so many people actually looked at that certificate, and we did too. And we talked about like how you organize your kitchen. What does that say about you as a person? Memories of objects, and we were looking at that, and we were also thinking about Virginia Woolf, like a room of one's own. And then we prepared, like, how are we now going to like present this material to the rest of the group when we're going to plenum? So what we did then was like, we just summarized, this is what we did. We selected a few data points to show, like as anecdotal information. And we also told them our key findings. And that is that just because there are no words, you only pack and unpack, but it's a heavily narrative game. But it's done completely without words, and how that actually works, how this enactive element lets us get into the story. And we were also thinking, like, for further study, what is interesting is that aspect, and also what particular objects in the game and sequences should be closer studied if you want to really dive into this. So that was the result from that group in that jam.
Right, and maybe I should say, or we should say another one or two sentences, because I think we sort of assumed many of you had played unpacking, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So in general, what you do in unpacking, you unpack, right? It's a game where you find yourself in an apartment, and you have moving boxes, and you unpack these moving boxes, right? And that takes a while, and you have total freedom where you can put these objects, or, a lot of objects you can put wherever you want, but there are some significant objects that have a specific place, right? And once you're done unpacking in one apartment, that level is over, and then you get to unpack in a different apartment. And what transpires over the course of the game is basically a woman growing up. Initially, she's a child, and when she becomes a teenager, and she moves to university, and she moves in what we just seen with a boyfriend, and when things continue further, and basically, in a sense, it's an emergent narrative of this person's life. That's what's going on here. Yes. Using SPP for analysis, okay, I'll have sort of the same slides again, but I mean, the difference was this time the participants were, and that's clearly one of the lessons learned, they were much better prepared. And that means, we had much clearer results. We were actually able to identify a proto-story and the elements. Here, in terms of procedural components like spatial rules, object placement rules, rules for stickers. At one point in time, you can also populate a sticker book. You might find stickers, so that's an additional things. We were able to identify the 3D models, 2D graphics, so it's kind of a 2.5D thing. We saw many different UI elements, and one might think on first look that there's no words here, and during the level there's no word, but when the level closes, you get a date, and you get some sort of a contextual information. It's basically only one sentence, but it's important, and it clearly places that. So that's what you only see when you start looking also at the UI, basically. And, you can actually do a fast replay, right? So you see where you actually placed everything, which can be quite a while. And we were able to identify the overall narrative design. It's a total of 8 levels of 8 episodes. These episodes are spatially organized with different rooms. Initially, you only have your children's room where you can put stuff, but when it becomes your own apartment, then there's, of course, a kitchen and a bathroom and a living room and a bedroom. So, of course, the spaces get bigger and bigger, basically. So we were able to see that, and we could clearly see how these things come together create this experience and create one particular product, one particular walkthrough through the choices that you make by placing these different elements. So again, for my group, much better than the initial experience because of better preparation. Yeah, particular insights.
Yeah, so when it came to Firewatch, what we found, like in the retellings group, was this kind of tension and what has happened. What was interesting was that Anna-Kaisa's group, who was doing the praxeology, they had access to the developer backlog, so they could kind of look into how had the design process actually happened. What development choices did they do depending on their timeframes and products, and that actually explained some of the lack of the perceived lack of global agency, like that there was only like one ending, and that. So it was very interesting to see that, all right, things that people reacted on, it had a history in the development and the design choices that the dev team were forced to make. And I think they even like had kind of like someone knew someone on the dev team, so they could actually kind of like, you know, have a quick phone call and like ask them about things, which was cool. So that was kind of one thing. So what did you have for unpacking?
Well, I mean, yeah.
No, it's for Firewatch, sorry.
Yeah, Firewatch. Well, but I mean, it was really eerie to see that the group from Jesper and René, you know, in their playthrough experience had exactly what came out in the praxeology. It was really great to see this, you know, coming together, basically. Like I said, I think in my group, we with Firewatch, we were not that great. We just barely made it through an analysis of the introduction. But of course, I mean, here again, we saw, you know, sort of from a praxeology perspective, how this sort of mixing of 2D hypertext and a 3D environment actually worked out. And, you know, nobody seemed to have a problem with that. Yes.
Yeah. So, and when it came to unpacking, it seemed like all of the groups had focused on the same objects, like the really important objects that had been there, especially the diploma and some other objects that kind of came through that. So that kind of meant that this was, unfortunately in this jam, we didn't have a praxeology group. And that we kind of felt that would have been really good to have. Someone who had a back channel to the developers to also have that lens. That was missing there. So that was something that we learned about that. What did you have for unpacking?
I think one also particular insight we had is, so the gender of the player person, or, you know, of the person whose things you unpack isn't clear in the beginning. Right? I mean, you might find hints, but with the child, you cannot be entirely sure. And that this is sort of gendered as a woman becomes clear much later through the objects, right? But there's nothing telling you that. So, I mean, sort of this discovery over the course of, you know, you had to go to the second or third level until that was clear, for example. Mm-hmm. So you could see how these things came together in this particular narrative design to make sort of give you, oh, there's an insight here. Oh, she must have been at university because I find this object. Mm. Right?
And that was also something, it was when we kind of prepared this, we realized that something that was lacking in our process was to have a final write-up. Because this was something that we did intensely at the conference. Then everyone kind of rushed off back to their duties wherever they came from, and then, oh yes, this was a great experience. But what we didn't do was have like, okay, let's get together and just like quickly summarize this. So we have a couple of recommendations for like how to set up. Is it you now? I can't remember.
I mean, it's clearly both of us, yeah. And so, but small groups are fine, but we would say at least 2 to 3 participants per method. Have a designated note-taker person per method. That is absolutely crucial. But not only per method, but also for the results in the plenum. I think that's something we kind of forgot in the first one. Mm-hmm. We had notes from the individual groups, but not so much from what happened in the plenum. I think we would also recommend video recordings, right? Of course, I mean, every participant has to be okay with that. But I mean, that would help a lot, and nowadays there's a number of platforms online that can actually extract the text from that automatically. So, you know, this is where AI can actually help us. And of course, have a plan for delivery of the results document, and that's something that is a moving target for us. Yeah. We totally admit that. And of course, you know, we could normally write this up, but that might also be very limiting, right? I mean, ideally, that could be a multimedial experience showing, let's say, parts of a playthrough. You could hear some discussions of the participants, right? And of course, that does not align well with existing paper formats, with existing proceedings, with existing journals. So that is really a challenge for publication, right? And something to think and work on, basically. Yes, and in education.
So one way to do this could have a class, but then you would probably need more than 4 hours because then students would probably learn how to apply different lenses. But having students look at one particular artifact and then assemble a wiki about it could be a viable method for this. And as I said, the whole idea why we did this was like, how can we use the hive mind to quickly do things, and what are the uses? So given the amount of time we have for analysis, if there is a research project studying a particular game, let's say Unpacking or Firewatch or whatever, having 20 people doing a kind of multi-method analysis, identifying very quickly, these are the important aspects, these are the potential methods for how to actually use that. I mean, consider the results of a thesis who had a kind of jam in the beginning identifying this in comparison to someone who just, okay, I know this tool, I'll try that because I like this game. This would be a much more informed research project. Another potential use is if you have built your own artifact, your game, and then assemble 20 people. Let's say that you have a 3-day workshop and you have, and everyone comes with their own prototype and put it through, each prototype put it through this process. What does that tell you about your own game for the future development, or how you explain it to other people? So that is the whole idea with MMA jams.
Yes.
I think we're on time.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we actually have time for questions, Sarah, please.
This is so fascinating, and I love this collaborative, sort of spontaneous approach to doing research. I'm curious, you know, like you said, you know, putting the results together can be the challenging part. I'm wondering also about synthesis, like if you have these very different perspectives that you're bringing, how do you create an argument?
Yeah, that is a challenge. Like for both of these things, at the end in the plenum, we had like lots of the synthesis was happening in the plenum about how we approached the game. But then, of course, everyone was kind of like, yeah, I'm happy to write a paper about this. Yeah, you know, let's do it. But then again, okay, so who's going to be the main author? Who's going to assemble all the data? Who's going to interpret the data that is done? That's a huge challenge. And I don't have a direct answer for that. I think that would have to come from each of the groups, like who has the time and who do people trust to be their common voice, like who puts everything together. Like, of course, it's a collaborative work, but in the end, there's always someone who does the final proofreading and push the submit button. So, yeah.
I mean, maybe one solution could be that there needs to be a designated author to start with, who's the rapporteur, right? We have that in some settings, in some political settings, right? That's not the lead author, that's not the boss or something, that's the person who creates the report of it. You know, maybe that's something we should consider also in an academic setting. And again, I mean, I think another problem is the limitations of a textual form for that. And I mean, one of the projects that we're also both involved in, and we hope it starts this summer, is we're working on a new journal for interactive narrative research. And one thing we want to do there is to put interactive stuff within the articles, right? Which I feel is much overdue. You know, that we stop just talking about interactivity and have just screenshots of interactivity, but that say, okay, and now what I just talked about, try that out here, right? I mean, of course, that has also big implications, and I mean, it's a bit different than what we do here, but I think the reporting office would profit a lot from having that. And one you know, aspect of that is to talk to industry about something that professionally we think should be called game slices. Consider the ability you could show a 30-second part of a game at a particular moment in time with particular values, right? With particular, you know, things in your inventory, and tell people, okay, play that part here, right? I mean, we don't have that yet. It would be some sort of a demo, but a demo at a point in time, not at the start. I don't think it's technically impossible, but we're not there yet. Right? So I think that would be one part, you know, several parts of the puzzle, maybe rethink authorship in terms of rapporteurship, have, you know, a multimedial representation, and of course, you know, I think we were very well organized with the groups and getting all of that done, you know.
Yeah, the preparation was great, the post-processing.
Yeah, that's, you know, the next project.
So you mentioned very briefly that the amount of material generated is massive,
Yeah.
right? So do you have any, like, already thought of strategies how to deal with that, or is it just like seeing it as like a mapping out of a field and then picking wherever you go in?
Yeah.
How are you going to
Like in these workshops, we just kind of threw everything together on a Google Drive. And also, like, we didn't go into, because I mean, like each work group had, because the whole thing was like introduction for half an hour, 2 hours analysis, 1 hour plenum. So it's only 2 hours. So it's mostly kind of like identifying potential data sources, doing a first trial run. Is this even viable to do? Then it would be like going into a deeper project, if it's even something that anyone wants to do. Then that would need its own data management strategy.
I mean, that's why on this slide we mentioned wikis.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, and of course we understand also the limitations of, you know, the particular wiki format.
Yeah.
You know, but something going into this direction.
Yeah.
We can take one more questions.
What is this for? Like, how can we use this for game development, or is this only just to look at games that have already been made and what we can take away from them?
Good question. Like, this was very much in an academic context, like how you would do it. I think that when it comes to game dev, when reaching some sort of beta stage before it's released, or if it's an episodic thing, that could be something to look at in order to see like how now I'm thinking specifically of retellings, kind of informing content analysis, to kind of gauge what is, like, when it reaches the players, what is really resonating deeply into them, and how can that either be enhanced, or if something that the team has put a lot of effort into developing, if players don't really care about it, well, maybe, you know, direct the resources for the dev towards what's really meaningful. Does that answer your question? Not really. Yeah.
I mean, you either move to the right audience for your game, or you already have an audience and need to change your game for the audience you already have. And then there's the question of different games need different things because of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, for
So,
sure.
I mean, for instance, if you're looking at from a scope of retelling, some games don't have a story. They're just there for you to play with.
No.
Yeah, but retelling could still mean people tell each other about the experience, even if there's not a story there in the traditional sense. And I think the way this could be used for development is, I think right now in beta testing, I mean, one way of doing the beta testing is used. You know, I think the idea could be here to say, okay, let's try different ways of beta testing. I mean, maybe, you know, playing, of course, is one form of beta testing. A focus group is another form of talking about an artifact. I mean, what we are proposing is doing both maybe at the same time. And if we talk about retellings, you know, if you'll ask your beta testers like a week later, what stuck with you? What do you still remember? Right? So basically adding additional perspectives and not just standing with one.
Yeah. Also, I'm not sure. I mean, all methods, I think this, when we thought about this was kind of real understanding already existing games. Perhaps in the development, if you have real control over the development, then it would make sense. But again, like, this is a potential tool, and maybe like a commercial game during development is not the right nail. So it's, yeah. So I think that would be up to developers to really.
I think we're going to let you come forward to talk to them afterward, because we need to let other people move so they can catch the last break. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.